Iron Claw is really a great film. And personally, I think it's one of the best films of 2023. It tells an amazing but ultimately true story of four brothers and their father's obsession with professional wrestling. The family is said to be cursed as they are constantly plagued with what seems to be bad luck, and the father tells his sons that if they become the toughest and the strongest, then nothing will be able to hurt them. The father is really the central figure to understanding what is going on and to understanding the reasons as to why the family have this so-called curse. The contrast between the opening scene, where we see the family living out of a trailer, and the next scene during which we see how far they have come, gives us an appreciation for how hard the father has worked and how much he has done for the family. We now see them living in a big house, and the parents have brought up four young boys who seem to be very disciplined. The father has been key in providing for the family as well as disciplining the boys, and at this stage there is no indication that there may be something fundamentally wrong with his thinking. However, as the film goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that his obsession with wrestling is not a healthy one, and neither are his relationships with his sons. The subtle signs of this begin to appear early on in the film, and a quote by Carl Jung came to my mind. "The greatest burden a child can bear is the unlived life of its parents." I think this film shows very well what Carl Jung meant by this. Fritz's dream was to become the heavyweight world champion, something that he didn't manage to achieve, and this has scarred him deeply. He feels as though he was wronged, and he wants to right this wrong by making his sons reach the pinnacle of professional wrestling. Not only does he push them physically beyond what is healthy, but more importantly, he doesn't take into account what they want to do with their lives, and instead brings upon his sons a massive burden of pressure through his dissatisfaction with their efforts. This feeling of not being good enough is really damaging to the sons' psyches, as I will discuss later, but the irony of this so-called curse that Fritz is trying to avoid is brought upon the family by him. The curse is sort of a predetermined destiny, which made me think of another Carl Jung quote. "If you fail to make the unconscious conscious, it will guide your life and you will call it fate." If we replace the word fate with the curse in this quote, it also applies very well to this story. In the end, Kevin is the only one who avoids this tragic destiny, and he does this through self-consciousness and self-awareness. The first glimpse of this happens very early on in the story. During the opening scene, in which the Von Erichs are having breakfast, we get an introduction to some of the dynamics within the family. Although at this point we take what Fritz is saying with a pinch of salt, it is clear that Kevin is the favourite son, and the one who is most likely to achieve his father's goal, whereas Mike, the youngest, is least like the other brothers and is called out by Fritz. Kevin realises that his dad is being too harsh on his brother Mike. Recognizing the dynamics in other families and how they affect individuals' personalities is not too difficult, but having the self-awareness to notice problems in your own family and try to fix them, especially at such a young age, I think is fairly admirable. Most people would just bask in the glory of being the favourite son. However, Kevin does truly and deeply care for his brothers and does not see them as his competition. He tries to approach his mother for help and explains to her that Fritz is being too harsh on Mike. However, she does not want to get involved. The film doesn't delve much into Doris's character, which is fair enough, as there are already a lot of characters to try get our heads around. Kevin cares for all his brothers, however his relationship with David is probably the strongest of the three. David looks up to Kevin a lot, and he wants to be just like him. After Kevin wins the non-title fight against Harley Race, David is really happy for him and is excited by his performance. However, Fritz is disappointed with Kevin as he believes he took too long to get up after being slammed onto the concrete. He makes Kevin feel like he didn't do good enough, and because of this, Kevin is angry at himself. David reacts the way Fritz should have reacted, with pride and adoration for Kevin's victory. However, instead, Fritz praises David's performance on the microphone and is critical of Kevin. This is a good example of how Fritz manipulatively pins the brothers against each other in an effort to make them do better. This causes Kevin to lash out at David in frustration, something that is really out of his character. Eventually, David is picked over Kevin to fight for the World Heavyweight title, which comes as a massive surprise to both of the brothers. This is another manipulative move from Fritz, who knows this would have hurt Kevin and he wants to make a point. However, Kevin is slowly becoming aware of how unjust Fritz is being, and how it is affecting him and his brothers. David, on the other hand, is completely oblivious to the situation, and he trusts his father and his methods wholeheartedly. When Fritz showed disappointment in Kevin's performance against Harley Race, David played this off as a tactic by Fritz to keep Kevin grounded. David's desire to be like his older brother and his trust in his father will only make his story all the more tragic, as he eventually overworks himself preparing for his title fight and dies due to inflammation of the small intestine. Kevin later volunteers to take David's spot in the title match, and he rightfully expects his dad to grant him the opportunity. However, Kerry interrupts and insists he also wants the title fight. Kevin's relationship with Kerry is a lot different to his relationship with David. David looked up to Kevin, and he almost felt bad that he was offered a title fight before him. Kerry, on the other hand, sees Kevin as his competition, and the reason as to why he's not getting the recognition he craves. Kerry seems to be suffering from middle child syndrome. He wants to gain his father's approval, like all the other brothers, but on top of this, he feels as though he is not getting it because he is being overshadowed by them, especially by Kevin. Fritz flips a coin to decide who will get the title fight, which again feels like a slap in the face for Kevin. However, Kevin takes it well and fully supports his younger brother, Kerry, who wins the coin toss. Kerry goes on to win the heavyweight title, essentially achieving his father's goal, which initially makes everyone ecstatic. However, this joy doesn't last long. After the celebrations, Kerry and Kevin are left alone. Kerry admits to him that he is on a come down, and there is a sinister undertone in the air. Kerry then goes on a motorbike ride, and just before he crashes, we see a close-up of his face, and we can see there is a lot of pain and anger in his eyes and a self-destructive look. Kerry's accident wasn't an accident, it was self-inflicted. But if all Kerry wanted was his father's approval, why did he still feel so depressed after achieving his father's ultimate goal? This is because Kerry has suppressed his feelings of being inadequate, which have been caused by his father Fritz. This feeling, however, will not go away no matter how deep it is buried, and no matter what Kerry achieves in an attempt to make himself feel better. As Sigmund Freud said, unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. Kerry needs to consciously come to terms with the feelings and their origin in order to rid himself of the pain instead of continuously running from them. Unfortunately, Kerry never becomes conscious of his unconscious emotions and continues to struggle mentally, unlike Kevin, who slowly begins to realize the bigger picture. Tragedy then strikes again. The youngest brother, Mike, is pressured into professional wrestling by Fritz and is trained by Kevin. The fact that Fritz pushes Mike into the sport even after Kerry had become a heavyweight champion shows us that he will never be satisfied, and this is because he is trying to correct the past. However, we know the past cannot be changed. Instead of coming to terms with what has happened to him, which has probably been traumatic for him, he tries to endlessly correct it. Similarly to Kerry, he needs to face his demons and not run from them, something that he never does, and he passes his trauma onto his sons. Mike has never shown any interest in wrestling, and he should have never been allowed to compete, so it is not surprising that he injures himself. Unfortunately, he goes into a coma after there are complications during the surgery, and eventually awakens with brain damage. As if this wasn't enough, Fritz still wants him to compete. Mike had other dreams. He wanted to be a musician, and just like Kerry, he felt inadequate in his father's eyes. Unlike Kerry though, he knew he could never be the wrestling superstar that his father wanted him to be, and therefore he thought that he will never be good enough in his father's eyes, which is why he took his own life. What Mike didn't know is that no one will ever be good enough in Fritz's eyes, and that this is not something he should be ashamed of. Soon afterwards, we see what I think is a pivotal scene in the movie, at least from Kevin's perspective. Kevin fights Ric Flair for the heavyweight title, however, things do not go as planned. He holds on to the Iron Claw move for too long, causing his opponent to bleed, and he is disqualified. I think during the fight, Kevin's subconscious emotions took over, mostly the frustration with his father Fritz. In the changing room, we see a really big contrast between Kevin and Ric Flair. Physically, Kevin is in much better shape than Ric Flair, who is drinking beer after the fight. But more importantly, the contrast between their mindset stands out clearly. Kevin is so disappointed with himself he can barely speak, whereas Ric Flair has a much more down-to-earth attitude about the situation and is even happy to fight Kevin again, even though he had squeezed his head until he started bleeding. He sees the whole situation for what it is, and he is just happy that the fans enjoyed the show. Kevin sees this. He sees that even Ric Flair, who he just fought, is happy for him, and he begins to realise that his dad's mentality is not something to look up to. As the scene closes, Kevin is staring at the floor, and a little smirk seems to appear on his face, as he feels the relief of becoming conscious of what is going on. During Kerry's final days, we see he is really suffering mentally. He has been bottling up his emotions for so long that any subtle rejection by his father can set them off. We see this happen when his dad doesn't immediately try out the gun that he gives him as a present, which makes him go into a childish tantrum. By the end of the film, Kevin has realised what is going on, and his ambition to be a professional wrestler has therefore faded away. Unfortunately, he has not been able to save any of his brothers, and in the end, he realised his father is to blame. In the final scene, we see him crying, further emphasising that he has abandoned his father's morals, who used to tell him and his brothers that they shouldn't cry. By crying, he is also expressing his emotions and healing instead of suppressing them, which he and his brothers previously did, and it brought them a lot of pain.